Hi there you guys, welcome back to my channel, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Joesephyr and this is my Starter Deck Re-volved series where I'm taking all 5 of the Final Fantasy trading card game starter decks and trying to zhuzh them up a little bit so that you guys can get stuck right into this really great game and share this out with your friends, or if you're already seasoned at the game you can share this with new players and help them get into it. Today we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy X starter deck, which is actually very well known for being strong straight out of the box, but we're going to make some little changes to this deck so that we can kind of up your game just that little bit extra so that you kind of get that little taste of power, so you might want to consider getting into the tournament circuit for these things. So if you want to know how to kind of pick up the Final Fantasy X starter deck, a few boosters and just kind of go with it, then keep on watching. As with all of my Starter Deck Re-volved decks, I'm only going to be playing 2 hero cards and 0 legends in the deck, and the reason for that is so that the deck is as easy to acquire for new players as possible. If you want to add more heroes and legends, then you do you and you go nuts, because obviously this is just meant to be a starting point for anyone who's just getting into the game. And just like all of the other starter decks, this deck is going to have 23 forwards, 9 summons and 18 backups. So we're going to go straight in with the wind forwards to begin with, and honestly the star of the show when it comes to the Final Fantasy X, or pretty much more specifically the Final Fantasy X-2 deck, is Pain. Pain is just phenomenal in terms of being a value card. She's so good. If you have a Yuna and a Riku out, she is free and draws you a card. So she's free on your resources completely and free on your card advantage and just generates your field. There is absolutely no reason not to run 3 of this card. She is, honestly, in my opinion, I used to hate the card. Absolutely hate her because she was that good and she irritated me to high heaven. But honestly, if you're going to be playing this deck, you simply must run 3 of her. And honestly, she's so good that both copies of her are really good. This one is from Opus 2, and she has an EX burst which allows you to search out the other 2 YRP members, which are Riku and Yuna respectively, obviously, and they can aid you just to have your consistency, and there's ways of getting rid of Pain off of your board later so that you can continue to play the other one, which is obviously that much stronger and more field efficient. And then going off, we're going to stick with 1 copy of the Riku from the starter deck, who looks extremely powerful on paper, and she is decent. However, forwards are a lot easier to remove in this game than backups are. So the reason that we're only running 1 of this Riku is because we're trying to make sure that you have the consistency of having Yuna and Riku in your backup slots so that you can have more room to play your Pains more consistently and more efficiently. However, I do like to have 1 copy in this deck because it's in the starter deck and it's it is powerful if you have a Yuna and a Pain out. So I thought it would be quite nice to run a single copy of her in here. And then, this is a weird one, but I've gone with a single copy of Winddrake. The reason that you go for a single copy of Winddrake is twofold. The first one is you have quite a few different coming into play effects, such as Pain, and you can use Winddrake to pick your Pain back up after a turn of him being there, and then you can just play the Pain back down again, and then because you activate all of your backups from playing the Pain, you can just play the Winddrake back down again. So it means that you have a really efficient kind of card advantage generator that your opponent really does have to answer quickly. And then the other reason is that Winddrake allows you to dodge board wipes really well. So if your opponent plays something like a Shantotto, which wipes the board clean of forward, you can just go, oh okay, I'd much rather have Winddrake and something else, probably Pain, back in my hand, so I don't have to deal with like my board getting wiped and you've probably just lost out by playing the Shantotto. So I actually really like this card in general, and it's not one that sees a lot of play at the moment, so it's something to think about at least. And then 2 copies of Sky Pirate Replica, because I honestly think that it's just a very strong value forward, which is what the main focus of this deck is about, is just having forwards. Kind of think of it like a White Weenie Rush deck from Magic. That's the best way to kind of describe it. We've had black in the Type 0 deck, we've had green in the Final Fantasy VII deck, and we're now going with kind of, the White Weenie Rush in this deck. So I definitely think that Sky Pirate Replica is really good at just providing advantage again. And then Ranger, which is the last wind forward we have here, is just something that's difficult to target early in the game. Like if you get this down turn 2, you can actually do some pretty nasty things with it. And I just generally like any card that can avoid being hit by anything. So I quite like having a couple of copies of Ranger in here. Moving into the water forwards now, we're going to start with 3 copies of Waka, who is somebody that's present in the starter deck, which is handy. And Waka is just good. When Waka attacks, you can choose any of your forwards and give it +1k for every forward you control. And given that this deck is very good at assembling a board very quickly, it's just very, very good value, and his S ability can absolutely turn the tides in your favour when used correctly. Your opponent's attacking you, you block, you go, okay, your guy's 1,000 now, I don't care how big you were to begin with. It's just very, very strong, so definitely run 3 copies of Waka in here. And then 2 copies of Tidus are in here, and I honestly don't think this Tidus is that great a card. This legendary Tidus would be lovely in here, but obviously we're trying to make it easy as possible for people to get, so we've gone with 2 copies of the starter deck one. If you've got the Final Fantasy X guys out, which you're likely to have because you have you know, Wakas and Pains, etc., he is going to be good value because you're going to get a 9,000 power guy, which hopefully has Brave due to you having backup Yuna out. You know, it's just a good, you know, strong forward, which is nice because this deck doesn't have that many of those. But just be cautious of the fact that because we're not running any forward versions of Yuna in favour of the backup ones, the ability that says if your Yuna goes to the break zone, draw 2 cards will not trigger because it has to be a forward version of Yuna that dies. But you do get the Brave out of it if you have her, so it's worth having a couple of him in here. And then we're going with 2 copies of Semblance of a Witch, which is Artemisia's Mannequin from Dissidia. Again, it's just a nice card, nice value, 3-drop water, 7k, stays on the curve, which means that its power is equal to the average cost of a 3, in this case a 3-drop, which is 7,000, and it has a nice effect tacked onto it. So if your opponent attacks you, you have an opportunity to freeze it, meaning that it doesn't activate during your opponent's next turn, which means that you can just kind of regain the momentum and keep just pushing yourself faster and faster. And then 3 copies of Queener, because I think Queener is actually very, very strong in a deck like this because you accumulate hand very quickly through your Pains and Windrakes, etc. In fact, Windrake and Queener have a really nice interaction because if you attack with a Queener and they decide to block it, you can then Windrake himself and something else back to your hand to make your Queener 2,000 stronger because you now have 2 more cards in your hand. It's risky because obviously you're losing the cards on your board, but it's something worth bearing in mind. And Queener is just a nice solid forward again, similar to Tidus and Waka, where you just have guys that are bigger than they have any right to be. And then lastly, we're finishing up with 2 copies of Larsa, which we also ran in the Final Fantasy IX deck as well as Queener, because we're not running Minwu in this deck for favour of, you know, keeping it down to 2 heroes where possible. And Larsa has very much the same effect as Minwu, which is to stop your forwards taking damage unless it's lethal to them. But one thing that I've noticed is that people who play against Larsa tend to forget that he has a second effect that's actually very strong. It's you know, simple 2,000 power booster to your guys can actually tie the ties in battle, especially if your opponent forgets that it's there. So I actually really like Larsa in most decks anyway, so I definitely want to run it in here. Moving into the win backups now, we're going to start with 3 copies of Opus 1 Aerith. Now this Aerith has fallen off in favour a little bit in favour of the new Opus 3 Aerith, but that Aerith is legendary, and this one, which means that this one is very, very easy to acquire. At one point it was very, very highly sought after and in demand, but you know, and that's because it's just very, very good, and it stays in theme with the deck of just being able to spew out cards where possible, because when you play Aerith, it activates 3 of your backups. So if you've got 3 out, it's just a free card. So you could just play that, and then you can play Pain, and then you can play, and you just continue playing cards over and over and over again until you're just overwhelming your opponent. And then because you have that one Windrake in there, you know, you don't have to worry so much about overextending and your opponent trying to board wipe you, because you can save it basically. It's just very, very good. And Aerith here, you know, because of the way that she's worded, and I've gone over this a few times in my videos, but her S ability that stops your forwards from being able to be targeted can cancel your opponent's effects that target your guys. So say your opponent tries to Odin, which is your basic kill spell in this game, tries to Odin one of your forwards, you can then activate Aerith and your forward is no longer a valid target, so the Odin fizzles, much in the same vein as Magic. So it's definitely, you know, if you're going on a budget deck, this is one of the best cards that you can get. And then we're going with 2 copies of Riku because, well, Riku is one of the backbones of this deck, and there is an Opus 1 Hero Riku, which we could have run in here, but I decided that because we have this Riku available, we'd go with a different hero card, which I'll get to in a second. But this Riku is just a decent addition to your EX burst count, which is nice. So it means that you can be a bit more aggressive, or you can play Riku after you've played a couple of forwards and attack with them so that you can then block with them. It's quite a versatile card. If you can pick up copies of the Opus 1 Riku, however, I would prefer you to run 3 copies of that over both the forward Riku and this Riku. It's something that I would definitely suggest for the future, but as we're kind of trying to stay as cheap as possible, this one is definitely sufficient. And then the 2 hero cards we've gone for in this deck are Maria. Maria is just a card that everybody should try and get hold of as quickly as they can, because it's just a straight up power booster for every unit that you have. And in this game, that 1000 power boost can make all the difference. In Magic, like an Anthem effect isn't that big a deal usually. It can be, but it's rare. In this game, because forwards are the only way to deal your opponent damage, realistically, and combat is a lot more important in this. This card can save you, and therefore I would very highly suggest that anyone who's getting into this game get hold of at least 2 copies of this card as soon as possible. It's that important. And then we're going to go with a single copy of Brother, because every deck should have a searcher, and this one comes in the starter deck, which is handy. So you can just play one Brother, which can search up your Pains, can search up your forward Riku, can search up Waka, can search up Tidus. It's just very versatile. But because we're running the 3-drop Pain that can search for Riku or Yuna, I figured that 1 copy was sufficient for this deck. And then lastly, to round out the number of 2 CP wind backups we have, and because it's a very good card anyway, we're lastly finishing on an Archer. And Archer is just a solid card to try and make sure that there's nothing getting in your way. Like, you can take out a power booster that's not Maria from your opponent's side that's specific to an element, so that you can swing it in your favour during combat, and it's just a particularly good card, so I quite like having it. If you want to run more copies of it, then go nuts. It's your deck at the end of the day, and I encourage you to change this deck to your specifications so that you guys are happy with it. It's all for you at the end of the day. So we're going into the Waters backups now, and honestly this first backup is probably the most important backup in the deck, and that's Yuna. Yuna makes all of your water summons 1 cheaper and triggers Riku and Pain, and therefore you must get out Yuna as early as possible in this deck, because Tidus benefits from all of your water summons, which the reason that the majority of the summons in this deck are water is because of Yuna. It's just a very, very good card in general, and with more cards coming out, more water summons, etc, etc, Yuna is only going to get better. So definitely pick up this Yuna instead of the one that's in the starter deck, because the one that's in the starter deck is far too prone to dying, meaning that your whole deck falls apart a little bit, whereas a backup version of Yuna is much, much easier to keep protected. And then we're going into 2 copies of Scholar. And Scholar is just a decent card for much the same reason as Windrake. If it can save your guy from getting killed. You can block with somebody and then break the backup so that you can pick it back up into your hand instead of it dying. It's like kind of a decoy card. Or if your opponent plays something like Shantato, again, I'll mention that as the most proficient board wipe in the game at the moment, you can just save one of your cards, and that can actually really change the game. So I definitely think that copies of Scholar make a lot of sense in this deck. And then we're going with a single copy of Quattro Queen, which is, again, a card I ran in the Final Fantasy IX Re-volved deck, which is nice, because it makes your guys difficult to deal with in combat. And especially in a deck like this where you're swarming the field as much as you are because of things like Pain and Tidus and Skypie Replica, Ranger, etc, etc, it's just a really, really good card to boost your guy as high as it can go so that it can beat other units in combat. But I only run 1 of it because it is a 4-drop at the end of the day, and you don't want to clog your deck with too many of those. And then lastly, we're going with not lastly, but the last 4-drop we're going with in this deck is going to be a Summoner, because it allows you to replay one of the summons that you've discarded or used already and put it back into your hand. And summons are a big part of this deck, so I definitely really would like to play at least 1 of this card. You may choose not to and choose to run a second Quattro Queen, or may choose to run 2 Summoner. Again, it's entirely up to you. And then the last 2 cards I'm running in this deck are a copy of Rosa. Rosa is a card that I think needs to see more play in general, especially when Lightning is as popular as it is, because it allows you to draw cards in response to your opponent targeting your guys with forwards. I only like 1 copy of it because there are a lot of summons in the game that don't target, so it is worth mentioning that. But if you're going into a matchup against somebody you know is running a lot of summons that do target, Rosa can actually benefit you a great deal. And there's no sideboard present in the Final Fantasy TCG, so it's definitely something that you kind of have to factor in your main deck by having a little bit of a toolbox but not too much of one. It's quite an interesting balancing act that the game has. So I like to run 1 copy of Rosa, you may choose not to. And then lastly, a single copy of Geomancer, which quite honestly could be an extra copy of Scholar. I just quite like Geomancer, to be quite honest. I like kind of playing that blackjack, playing my odds kind of feel to a game. I like kind of testing my luck, if you like. So, I mean, it's a fun card. You can kind of respond with it to check the top card of your deck in response to your opponent attacking you and then put it on the bottom, or you can do it at the end of your opponent's turn or during the end of it, like when they're in their second main phase, so you can see what you're about to draw. I kind of just like it, but I know a lot of people don't. So if you don't particularly like Geomancer, honestly just run a 3rd copy of Scholar because it benefits this deck just as much, if not more. And then finally we're going to go into the summons now, and we're only going to run 2 wind summons in total here, which are going to be copies of Sylph. Sylph is just kind of a power booster, which is handy and it can, you know, benefit your guys quite nicely. You could opt to run Valor 4, which is in the starter deck instead of Sylph here, because it does it has the blanket effect of damage, and you're likely to have Una out, so you'll get the secondary effect from it as well. I just prefer Sylph to it because it doesn't require you to have Una out to benefit from its maximum potential. And, you know, there are a lot of cards like Larsa or Minwoo that kind of negate that kind of damage, so I try to keep kind of chip damage to a minimum where possible in favour of combat tricks, but again, it's entirely up to you. And then the water summons, which take up the larger portion of the summons in this deck, include 3 copies of Leviathan, which at 3 drop, it's just very, very good. It's a very solid card. There are a lot of forward, like if you're against Ice or Lightning, Leviathan is a bit less useful because a lot of their cards have come into play effects that you don't really want to use, and ironically, never ever use Leviathan on Pain. Just trust me on this, I did it once and you regret it. It's not a very good idea. I don't know why I did it even that time, but never mind. But Leviathan is generally just a very useful card for just getting people off you, by allowing your opponent, when they hit you, you have a chance of returning it to their hand on damage because it's an EX burst. It's just a decent card. And then we're going to go with 2 copies of Cuckoo Lane, which is a weird one because Cuckoo Lane tends to maximise its potential based on the number of dull cards your opponent has, and therefore whether your opponent has dull cards before they attack you, which is never usually a particularly good idea. You should usually, not always, attack before you start playing cards, especially in a game that features things like EX Burst and can negate pretty much everything you just did. So it's a good exercise in training people not to do that. But it's a solid card anyway, especially when you have a Una out and it costs 3 instead of 4. Because of the fact that you're drawing a card, you're basically kind of taking 2 off of its cost. So when it only costs 1, it's just a good card, and it filters very, very nicely. So we've gone for 2 copies in this deck. And then lastly, we're going to go for 2 copies of Famfrit. Famfrit in this deck is phenomenal. In all honesty, you could easily switch around the number of Famfrit and Leviathan in this deck, and I'm starting to be more inclined to think that might be a good idea. But I like Leviathan because it's a much more basic card in this particular format that we're going for. Famfrit can make both players put, not break, one of their forwards into the break zone, which means that characters that can't be killed or broken by effects like Vincent can still die to this. And it doesn't target either, so cards like Delita or Kuja, who get benefits from being targeted, get nothing from this. So it's just a really, really strong card. And because you have cards like Pain or Ranger, Sky Pirate, that kind of thing, that you don't really care whether they die, you could just easily just use it, you lose your guy, and it's not a big deal. Or you can use it on, you can use it on the main thing that I wanted to say about the 3-drop Pain when we covered her, is that you can use Famfrit to get rid of her and one of your opponent's forwards in the process, and leave yourself room to play the, when I say the 3 CP Pain, they're both 3 CP, the EX Burst Pain, so that you leave yourself room to be able to play the Opus 1 Pain from the starter deck and be able to start getting your card advantage engine going. It's a very, very, very potent card, so I definitely want to run at least 2 copies of it in here. And that's it for this deck. I mean, you can kind of see the general consensus of what you're supposed to be doing with this deck. It's very much kind of like White Weenie Rush, as I'd said. It's all about accumulating a board very quickly and overwhelming your opponent with a large number of forwards rather than like them being massive, though Maria does tend to help with that, as do Queener and Waka. But if you like this video, then leave a thumbs up underneath, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We've still got 1 starter deck to go, which is Final Fantasy 13, so keep watching if you want to see what happens with that one. I've actually thought of 2 different ways to do that one, and I'm not sure which one I'm going to go with yet. I might just do both. And if you want to kind of get into the more competitive scene for it, I have lots of decks coming up soon that are going to be more, geared toward those players. And there's a couple that are already on this channel, and there's plenty of other stuff where that came from. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll speak to you guys soon. Bye.